Chapter 9 Leviathans Sometimes. Late in the afternoon of June 3, 2017, Karam Butt rented a white Renault van over the telephone. He had earlier attempted to rent a 7-ton truck, but couldn't provide sufficient details for payment. Butt was a Pakistan-born British citizen, reformed drug user, and known member of the constantly morphing Al-Muhajiroun jihadist group. Indeed, he was so well known that he appeared, briefly, on a Channel 4 TV documentary about the domestic jihadi threat in the UK. The 27-year-old Butt collected the van, accompanied by two friends, 30-year-old Rachid Radon and 22-year-old Youssef Sagba. Radon was a failed asylum seeker who moved to Ireland briefly before separating from his wife and child. He was a domestic abuser, while Sagba, a dual Moroccan and Italian national, was under surveillance by the Italian security services as a known ISIS sympathizer. The three men, their bodies fueled with massive doses of drugs, loaded the rented van with bags of gravel to make it a heavier battering ram, and then loaded 13 Molotov cocktails made from old wine bottles and lighter fluid. Each man wore a fake suicide vest and was armed with a carving knife, with a ceramic blade and a handle bound with leather strapped to their wrists. It is not clear what the intended target was, or if any indeed had been chosen. The three men cruised around London for around 2 hours. At 21:58, they drove the van across London Bridge, turned, and crossed the bridge once more. Then they performed a dramatic U-turn. At 22:05, the white van, traveling at speed, mounted the pavement and plowed into pedestrians. A BBC reporter who happened to be on the bridge that night told the journalist of seeing bodies being flipped into the air and into the River Thames. Several died instantly, while others, including a late-term pregnant woman, received grave injuries. The terrorists zigzagged the van along the pavement and on the road in order to hit as many people as possible before eventually crashing on Borough High Street. The three terrorists then exited the van, ran to the Borough Bistro, a small restaurant, and began stabbing customers. In terrorist attacks of this kind, there usually are many acts of great courage, some of the obvious kind celebrated as heroism, but others of a less recognized kind. In this case, Transport Police Officer Wayne Mark initially thought he was running towards a pub brawl, but it was soon apparent to him that he was running towards mortal danger. Yet he kept going. Mark fought with the terrorists armed with only a baton and suffered horrific wounds. Further into the market area, one man threw a crate at the terrorists to distract them and then hid 20 people in his bakery. Most famously, when the terrorists came to the Black and Blue restaurant and began their attack shouting, "This is for Allah," Roy Larner did not flee. Instead, he stood up and shouted, "Fuck you, I'm Millwall." Millwall is a football team notorious for its violent fans. Larner received multiple stab wounds while fighting the attackers with his bare hands. But not everyone grew up hard on the terraces. One is tempted to think in terms of micro-heroics to describe the customers who threw bottles and chairs at the marauders in order to buy time for others to assist and evacuate the injured. The attackers seemed to be everywhere at once. At one restaurant, an attacker walked in and calmly began to murder a woman. Customers fled out the back, where witnesses claimed to have seen unarmed police run away. For several minutes in the medieval market streets, the scene was of blood and screaming and dying. 8 minutes into the attack, however, armed police were moving through the streets, and journalists saw a strange helicopter land right in the middle of London Bridge. In London, unarmed police must be able to call upon armed officers and receive assistance within a few short minutes. If armed support is required to deal with a major terrorist incident, ideally there is time to bring in elite counterterrorism specialized firearms officers, CTSFOs. A retired London-based counter-terror police officer described CTSFOs to Mark as anticipatory, in that they responded to pre-planned events. London also has roving authorized firearms officers, AFOs, who respond to the spontaneous dangers that might arise. The events on London Bridge and in Borough Market on June 3, 2017 were spontaneous, and so it was units of AFOs that arrived on the scene. The final moments of the attackers are caught on film. A man strolling along the pavement is confronted by a figure wielding a large knife. The attacker attempts to stab the pedestrian in a manner that lacks determination. Then two other terrorists arrive to assist with the gruesome work. A large armed police car arrives at speed. Within 1 second, all 3 police occupants, including the driver, exit the car and open fire. The police move so quickly that they forget to apply the car's brake, and so it keeps rolling. The terrorists turn on the police officers. There is nothing cinematic in the poor quality CCTV footage, blurred by the flashing police lights. Terrorists slash with their knives, the police fire, moving forward and back to control the distance. Men fall down. Another police car arrives. A body is kicked to check for signs of life. All 3 terrorists lie dead on the streets. Others are injured too. The man who was stabbed bleeds heavily. A passerby was grazed by a police bullet ricocheting, and the driverless AFO car rolled over a policeman's foot. The London Bridge and Borough Market attack lasted less than 20 minutes. Armed police resolved the situation some 8 minutes after the first emergency call was made. The political questions raised by and consequences of violence, however, extended beyond the incident itself, like ripples that spread outwards from a stone dropped in water. Were the attackers acting alone, or was a larger plot afoot? Multiple buildings were evacuated, and numerous underground tube stations were closed. Fragments of news emerged to suggest that the dark emergency helicopter that landed right in the middle of London Bridge was carrying a 12-man Special Air Service SAS patrol. In the days that followed, the tabloid newspapers carried images of the Dauphin helicopter, nicknamed Blue Thunder, and a photograph of a heavily armed man in camouflage gear, bulging arms covered with tattoos, an athlete of a special kind, running alongside armed officers. Because the situation was uncertain and fluid, it was deemed necessary to open the tool shed and deploy men whose job it is to deliver certainty of a kind. In London, on June 3, 2017, Leviathan acted according to the script. Terrorists disrupted the civil order and were killed on the command of the sovereign. For Hobbes, the core problem of politics was the creation of order. Hobbes wrote out of the English Civil War, from which one could imagine a war of all against all, which he likened to the state of nature. Not incidentally, Hobbes was a brilliant translator of Thucydides, another tough mind in a tough time, the Peloponnesian Wars. Such wars taught that social order could not be presumed, it had to be created. Recognizing this, men came together to pool their powers and create a sovereign state. But men were subject to violent enthusiasms that they could not resolve peaceably. Order, once established, had to be defended from such conflicts, which could spiral out of control, as they had in England, within living memory. Therefore, argued Hobbes, for people to have any hope of a commodious existence, Leviathan had to be boundlessly strong, unopposable on any field of contest. The sovereign, in short, must be absolute. The alternative was civil war, the return to the state of nature, and the failure of politics itself. Absolute power has its own, rather obvious dangers. The political tradition that informs the U.S. Constitution, among other things, has struggled to create a state that is both powerful enough to establish and defend order, and yet so constructed that it does not descend into a tyranny. To paint with a broad brush, the effort from Locke and Sense has been to ameliorate the Hobbesian argument for absolute sovereign power, without much denying the Hobbesian imagination of politics. Checks and balances, limits on various sorts of discretion, the enumeration of human rights, and so forth are thought within the Hobbesian frame. Central to that frame is its dualism, Leviathan on one side, the people, including academics, on the other. This same dualism structures much political imagination and social thought today, as discussed in the preceding chapter. As has been pointed out innumerable times, while Hobbes is a mighty political thinker, Leviathan leaves much to be desired as sociological description of his day or ours. Life takes place between citizen and state, in the institutions of civil society, and the state itself turns out to be many things, only with force of imagination conceived to be unified, a sovereign king, Leviathan. The multiplicity of political authority has only increased with the growth of administration and bureaucracy, and the intermingling of powers under headings such as federalism, integration, and international law, as suggested in the last chapter. Whatever the failings of the Hobbesian imaginariist description, however, in some contexts and for some purposes, it makes sense to think, speak, and write in terms of Leviathan, or, for that matter, a monolithic neoliberalism. But sometimes it does not make sense to express oneself as if to Leviathan. Sometimes one needs a sociologically, and in that sense politically, accurate description. Sometimes one needs understanding, verstehen, and a little sympathy in order to have authority to be heard. Sometimes speaking truth to power is the surest way to be ignored. The difficulty is that new political imaginaries do not come along very often, and existing ones evolve slowly, if at all. How else might we imagine political authority, if not as Leviathan? This book has argued that a great deal of politics, including security politics, should be imagined in terms of the culture, institutions, and individuals that do the work at hand, collectively and not completely satisfactorily, bureaucracy. To that end, we have attempted to portray some of the challenges facing institutions and individuals as they attempt to provide security. The conceptual difficulty here is that the political imagination of bureaucracy is far less familiar and less developed than is the political imagination of power understood in terms of the sovereign. To the extent that our conceptions of bureaucracy are developed, and by extension many of our ideas of the modern state and much of the contemporary itself are developed, they have been articulated most famously by Weber. As should be clear by now, however, the portrait of the bureaucrat here is both in detail and in principle considerably at odds with Weber's ideal typical understanding of bureaucracy. The scholarly task, then, seems to be to move away from Hobbesian dualism into a more sophisticated social, institutional, and indeed psychological landscape. For politics, this will require a turn to bureaucracy, but considered less reductively and more sympathetically than Weber did. Power differently. By way of illustration and a grounded place to start, consider unarmed community policing in an airport, sometimes conducted under the banner of policing by consent. The same airport may also house extremely lethal close combat counterterrorism units, Leviathan and familiar guys, but not the only guys, as illustrated by a manager of airport police. We want to be the community police, like you would have in a village. We want to be the consistent community police presence, but we do have requirements under legislation. We do have compliance issues under EU legislation, but we have a population here of 25 billion passengers. We've just surpassed that this year, plus another 10 million meeting and greeting. So that's bigger than lots of countries. That's a lot of people passing through here. 15,000 office people work around here. So it's a community. And what I want to do is have my police officers out there as the problem solvers for people. But I don't have enough police officers. It's enough to do the job, but it's certainly not gold lined when you think about the size of this campus. In any given day, I have up to 1,000 staff here. This manager, like many others, tended to elide the term security by pointing instead to an extraordinary range of incidents and experiences. Before the ethnographic project even formally began, he warned, you will see lots of the incidents. You can get the stats, 6,000, 7,000 incidents we go through in the year. 2,000 of them could be medical incidents. We go to every medical call because we've all done first aid, training, cardiopulmonary resuscitation. I would always try and celebrate. I shouldn't say celebrate, but recognize. How many times can you say someone was dead and you saved them? But we now have incidents where we've got a huge increase in mental health issues arriving on our doorstep, and it's getting more and more acute. People in very, very distressed states. We've had 5 suicides in the airport, which is something I never saw. There's been an occasion where one of my officers had to talk a 14-year-old boy off the roof of the car park, standing outside ready to go, talk him down. We've looked at trying to give them counseling, and that's why we're trying to get more and more of yourselves. Tens of millions of mobile individuals in an airport raise a range of problems of astonishing breadth and depth. Heavy weapons and tactical gear fade into the background as other skills are put to more regular use. Here's another senior police officer's memory of dealing with an incident, which was recounted as advice to a trainee. Now, you can imagine yourself getting the call. She's totally distraught, totally incoherent. Well, the first thing I'd ask them, can we sit down to one side? Sit them down and then talk gently. And then look for a name. And then once you find it out or get a scrap of information, try and concentrate on that. He recalls. And as it transpired, I dealt with this woman who'd been up for 26 hours. Her husband, who she was estranged from, had put up stuff on Facebook which related to her children. And she was trying to get back to the United States to try and get to her children to tell them that, they weren't being abandoned by her. And everything just piled up and was on top of her tantamount to a nervous breakdown. But by having, she talked through the whole thing, talked it down, and knew that at that stage, the airline wasn't going to carry her that day because it was too much of a risk. The children, we made a phone call to them, let her talk to them, reassured her that they were okay, and then said to her, now we need to look after you. So convinced her that it was a good idea to stay overnight, organized a hotel down the road here by Airside, which is next door to the medical center because the airline would require medical certification and fitness to travel. I said, you could pop in there and get that, and then tomorrow when you come up, I'll look after your luggage. He turned to Mark. Now that, if you want, is an example that to me is community policing. Airport policing is a mix of customer service, community relations, and paramedical service. Over a 6-month period, Mark accompanied airport police as they dealt with drunk passengers, abusive partners, lost travel documents, or lost children. The latter occurs more frequently than one might expect. One day, reflecting on over 20 years of experience, one police officer had this to say. Around 10 years after I was first here, early 2000s, I suppose, it started to shift. I suppose then the methods then of policing have changed dramatically. I suppose in terms of a lot of what we do now is technology-led, and also, I suppose, intelligence-led, CCTV, body cameras. The days of an idiot like me dressing up like a fool has proved to be ineffective, and it's not really good. I mean, there's always been that battle as well, that on the one hand, you're working with a commercial organization and the state, and you have these huge and vast powers to stop, detain, arrest, and search, which is what is required of an airport. And then you're trying to marry these two together, and it's not a comfortable fit. If you are armed, there's a huge amount of responsibility and expectation involved in that, At this stage, I'll be 50 this year, married with 3 kids, 2 dogs, mortgage, etc. So I have a lot to consider. I came from an armed institution. I was in the Corps for 6 years before I was here. So it's not that I'm adverse to it or that I have any objection to it, but I think for me now, I don't know, carrying a firearm around kids, around families, it's just I'm at odds with it now. This sense of sand shifting beneath one's feet is pervasive and is felt across professional generations. Younger police officers discuss threats and responses using martial terminology more freely than their older peers, but they also express some doubt about being able to fulfill a counterterrorist role. These men and women are professionals with considerable experience, but the idea that one day they would have to face off against suicide attackers with explosives and machine guns understandably gave them pause. They saw the probability of a catastrophic event as low, but they knew they had to train for such an event and did so with the stoicism born of a certain powerlessness. Word had come from on high, apparently, elsewhere for sure, that aviation and airports were under threat and that airport police were now part of a global nervous system. Here are the words of the most senior security officer in that airport. To safeguard civil aviation from actual and awful interference. So that's the overall terminology for all the stuff that I deal with from a security perspective. That's the overarching goal. That's why they are here. That's why worldwide there's so much money pumped into security because, obviously, we have a number of different threats that occur from terrorists, and then we have other threats from people who would have a sort of revenge motive, or you have a disgruntled employee, or you have people with mental health issues. So there's just so many different avenues of threat against civil aviation, and again, as I said, the 1,200 people that we're talking about there, their role is to safeguard civil aviation from actual and awful interference. And that's laid down in legislation from both ICAO and the European Civil Aviation Conference. And then you also have the EU regulatory framework. And then you also have national legislation. At the end of the day, the role of the officer downstairs from a screening point of view is to make sure a gun, bomb, or any item that won't get through. And the role of the airport police is a proactive policing role. And then if something does happen, they react to that and solve the problem. He describes a recent incident during which a man hijacked a car at knife point, drove to the airport, and somehow managed to force his way through the fence and airside to the runways. The situation was resolved peacefully, but protocol demanded that the security officer place the black-clad counterterrorism close quarters combat group on standby. All he was willing to say was, it could have ended differently. So, again, you have the two elements. We have landside and airside. So landside is a movement area where anybody can move in, and airside is a restricted area, so only staff and passengers can go through. You have 2 layers of security within the airport. You have the security screening staff, and then you have the police. So the police role wherever he or she is proactive policing, which would then be reactive to a given scenario. As threats airside and now landside accumulate, those charged with security are required to imagine, anticipate, and act with an eye on the horizon of the near future. Police concretize their roles by thinking about what could go wrong. They are searching not just for solutions to immediate problems, but also for deeper responses to inescapable anxieties. Leviathan indeed.